AMH, of course, was built as a convalescent hospital in the 1870s. Atkinson Morley was a hotelier. His hotel was in Trafalgar Square. I haven't got it here, but one of Fox Talbot's first photographs of the erection of Nelson's column in 1845. You can see a building in the background where now South Africa House stands, saying Morley's Hospital. And he was a patient at St. George's in the days when it was a Hyde Park corner, and the sound of the horse-drawn traffic outside was so unpleasant. When he died, he left money for a convalescent hospital to be built. And this morphed into a specialist neurosurgical unit in the 1940s under Sir Wiley McKissock, who was this radical man. The people who trained me had mainly been trained by him. And I felt they'd all been left quite scarred by the experience. But he wouldn't, when he appointed you to a job, he wouldn't then recognize you for at least 6 months, and he'd storm past you in the corridor just to make sure you knew your place in the pecking order. And I heard endless stories about him. But he built it up, and he was a man, in fact, of considerable vision, because as a result of him, Hansfield came to AMH and developed CT scanning. In the 1970s and early 80s, AMH was the worldwide name to reckon with because of CT scanning. Then a few years in 2003, we were moved from the beautiful verdant gardens of south of Wimbledon to this rather dull PFI building at St. George's. And this was a very interesting experiment of nature to see the contrast in having been working for years in a small, dedicated, single specialty hospital to being part of a big 1,200-bed hospital in London. As part of this, my ontological wife, Kate Fox, tells me we should not take Dunbar too seriously and about the magic number of Dunbar's number. But he came up with this theory that the size of the human prefrontal cortex compared to other primates is related to the size of the social group. He does rather leave out givens, which are completely way off. And Kate says, yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. I'll stay here. Sorry. So it needs to be taken with a grain of salt. But the fact of the matter is, all of us who've worked in small single specialty hospitals know it has enormous benefits. You know all the staff at every level. Now, I remember it was very striking when we moved from Wimbledon to Tooting. Some of the porters from the old hospital left, some moved to St. George's, and they'd stop me in the corridor and say, "Oh, Mr. Marsh, it's not the same here in the old hospital when the nurses needed to turn a patient, you know, a common problem with paralyzed neurosurgical patients. We could all muck in and help, but now we're not allowed to do it." And the other porters say, "That's not your job." And it was on a microcosmal anecdotal level. It was an example of the way you had true team working, because everybody knew each other. And one of the big contrasts when you go into a great big hospital like the JR here or St. George's is you essentially work into a rather alien, hostile environment. The old AMH, when I went in, my patients would be sitting outside on the benches in the gardens. It felt completely different. And although the facilities for the patients would have done well in the Borstal, on the whole, patients liked it very much. They could feel this sense that there was a real sense of belonging, and you had windows you could open, and there were gardens, and I'll come back to that. So anyway, so Dunbar's number, the staff of AMH was 180. And I think that the idea of Dunbar's number is this is the maximum number of people. We can understand all the relationships between them as well as their relationships to us. And you lose that when you move into a large modern hospital. But things were very different. When I started working there, basically the consultants were dictators. Their decisions could not be questioned, were not questioned. And they were like, I felt they were like a sort of generation of lonely gods. And again, they never consulted between themselves. If they had a difficult case, you just sucked it up and did it. And there was very little follow-up afterwards. Cleaners worked madly long hours. I'm not recommending going quite back to that, but I'll talk about that a bit later. I never worked less than 1 in 1 or 1 in 2, although 1 in 1 was actually illegal. But you learned very quickly, to a certain extent, at the expense of the patients. And although I think the pendulum has swung too far to the other extreme now. It was not. It was a pretty cruel system, both on the juniors and on the patients. And in something like neurosurgery, it was really quite brutalizing, I think, is the word. But you learned a lot very quickly, and you had tremendous continuity of care. Consultants never came in at night. There was no night work at all. Everything was done by the senior registrar and the registrar on call. Occasionally, I'd ring up my consultants, and being AMH, I usually got a tirade of abuse down the phone. So, oh, it's you again, is it? Very, very good nursing, very dedicated nursing. There was the first school of neurosurgical nursing at the old AMH. Again, this very strong sense of belonging and teamwork. And it was fantastic, efficient. We've always had American residents coming to work with us. And they simply couldn't believe how much work we got through. Above all, there were only 10-minute turnarounds between surgical cases. And I was very amused. I had a note from my diary. I'm a fine list yesterday. Aneurysm, endoscopy, meningioma, MVD on the back. That is inconceivable to do a list like that. Above all, because now it's at least an hour or an hour and a half between surgical cases. And I was very amused to see this in the Times last week. Not that I read the Times, but I read this front page on the BBC News website, saying that Guy's Thomases have come up with this innovative system where they have 2 operating theatres and 2 surgeons and one anaesthetist gets the next patient to sleep while the other one is getting the patient off the table. This is exactly how we functioned 20 or 30 years ago. And it's quite interesting trying to work out why it would be so difficult to reproduce that now. They've reproduced that at Guy's Thomas basically by throwing money at it. They pay extra staff to cover it the weekend. The interesting thing is that 20 or 30 years ago, people worked like that without having to be incentivized by money. And of course, one of the big changes in the NHS has been now everybody's paid, in effect, paid by the hour, by the week. The idea of public service working till the work is done at the end of the day has largely gone. Coming back to the old school, there's minimal formal teaching. You just see one, do one, very bad, I think. So I'm not nostalgic about the past at all. No proper morbidity or mortality meetings or the equivalent. And litigation was very rare, never talked about it. Actually, a patient was daring to sue one of the consultants. And there's a very high threshold for tolerating bad outcomes, bad results. Nothing was explained to the patients or the family. And this, of course, was a much more deferential society than it is now. So there was a mixture of good things and bad things. But what is clear, it was much cheaper and much more efficient than the present situation. In 1987, when I became a consultant there, I was only one of 3 consultants. There were 2 senior registrars, 4 registrars, 2 SHOs, 3 dedicated ODAs who were the life and soul of the operating department, knew everything, could do anything. And we were doing about 1,000 operations a year. The situation now is a number of procedures has trebled, the number of consultants has gone up by about 4 or 5 times. And as it is, we actually have fewer consultants for the workload than most of the other major units in the country. There is an army of registrars and fellows and SHOs, and now we have physicians' assistants as well. So the actual productivity of the staff is way down compared to the past. There I am, enthusiastic young SHO at the Royal Free in 1981 when I started my neurosurgical training. I then went to Great Ormond Street and Queen Square and then on to AMH. I went into surgery thinking that neurosurgery and surgery was all about heroic individuals. I saw myself as a heroic individual. I was very competitive and ambitious. I don't think I was curiously intelligent. I was just very aggressive and ambitious, which often masquerades as being intelligent. And these are all the great names of neurosurgery: Cushing and Dandy and Lexell and Cairns, of course, who was here, and Godley and Horsley and Bob Spetzler, who's just retired from the Barrow in Phoenix recently. I left it. I actually left the NHS finally in 2017. I left it an absolute complete change of view. I see surgery now entirely as a question of teamwork, not just being nice to assistant nurses, but true teamwork with your fellow consultants. And I'll discuss a little bit about why I now understand why that's so important. I don't think that many people understand that, but it still is a problem with the surgical personality. Why is team working important? Well, you make better decisions. The fundamental human rule that other people are better at seeing my mistakes than I am, and I'm better at seeing their mistakes. And because of the optimism bias, we all think we're better than we are. Fewer mistakes, but only if in the team there is criticism. If it's like most MDTs, where things just get brushed under the carpet or everybody agrees, the MDTs, paradoxically, I think, in my experience, have not actually taken things forward very much. It all depends on how they're led and cultivating an atmosphere of true discussion rather than just rubber stamping process. Of your mental health, I think all medicine is highly stressful. I think it's a lot more stressful now than it was. I don't think neurosurgeons should all be weeping on each other's shoulders when we have yet another disaster. But to know you have colleagues who understand how you feel when something has gone wrong is extremely helpful. And my advice to my colleagues and my juniors, if there were complaints or litigation, I also don't do anything about it. Don't write any defensive letters yet. Push it to the back of a drawer or equivalent and go and talk to a colleague about it, just to sort your feelings out. So I think it's enormously important for your mental health, but you have good colleagues. A bit of training and learning, which I think is self-evident. The use of stretched resources, maybe. Of course, the fundamental rule about having good colleagues, which I think is so important, is you won't have good colleagues if you want a good colleague yourself. That charity begins at home. It's necessary, but not sufficient. You may still have one or two shitty colleagues who mess everything up. You may need one rotten apple in the department to cause an awful lot of harm. But then, of course, there are problems of team working. First of all, times. When I was doing criminology years ago here at Oxford, you worked out when some kind of power grab was going on in the Politburo because the Politburo was made bigger. And by making the Politburo bigger, basically you were emasculating it. And then it really meant there was an inner group who were calling the shots. And it's very hard to have effective team working if it's too large. But what the magic size is, I don't know. It changes all the time. It's going to be difficult. I said earlier, at the old Atkinson Morleys, we had wonderful operating department assistants. They'd worked in the department for years. They knew every piece of operating equipment. They could set anything up. When we moved to St. George's, they were basically told you have to rotate around all the surgical departments because this is efficient. It means all the ADAs can work in any specialty. They all left because they didn't like that. And also means now the ODAs are useless. They can do a little bit of everything. But having a part of team working is specialization. And my experience of the NHS management is, certainly in St. George's, they simply don't understand this. They say it is all about moving people around, training everybody. You end up making things much, much worse. Above all, it needs good leadership. Who's in charge? Good leadership is about encouraging argument and disagreement, but then resolving it to bring unity. And of course, my feeling in the NHS has been largely lost. They talk about clinical leadership now, but I'd say that in my experience, the biggest change in the years I worked in the NHS was the loss of my own autonomy and feeling less and less in control of what I was doing. I'd go to work in the morning. I had no idea whether I'd be able to operate or not. I had a list, but it would depend on the beds. You have to then negotiate with the intensivists. You have to negotiate with the intensive nurses. You have to negotiate with the step-down staff. This is mainly because of lack of resources. And it was a tremendous sense of powerlessness. You're all hyped up wanting to operate. In the old days, if I said 9 o'clock start, the patient was on the table at 9 o'clock. That never happens now. And often you ended up doing very major stressful surgery, starting it in the afternoon, which is a terrible idea. And this, is not good. But so, I mean, ultimately, obviously, in all clinical teams, the people who should lead are the consultants, the senior doctors. And then there's a problem of groupthink, which I think is a big problem with MDTs potentially if they're not well led. And I can give you a recent example. There was a rather nice slide, a cliche of modern leadership theory. That's the dictatorial, the old AMH, and the modern model is to be the supporting the team. I mean, it doesn't entirely apply to medicine because you have the problem of responsibility. When things go wrong, who holds the can when the patient's dead or the lawyers are suing? But it's a nice idea. But leadership should be more about support and empowerment than dictatorship. Now that's a patient just shortly before I finally retired. I was still operating a bit, mainly mentoring my trainee, who's excellent, who had taken over my job. That is a cerebellar hemangioblastoma, furiously vascular tumors, not on this slice, but patient had acute hydrocephalus, very ill. And they're basically like an arterial malformation, they're a massive blood vessel. And if you stray into the tumor, there's a very high risk the patient will exsanguinate. In fact, in the historical literature, solid hemangioblastoma, which is often mistaken for metastases on early CT scans. So the junior doctors are sent in to remove it. And there's about a 50% mortality for cases like that. And that case had been admitted under my colleague, my trainee, now who'd taken my job. And he didn't want to operate. He was a bit frightened about it. And we had an NDT meeting with the radiotherapist. And the radiotherapist, bless their cotton socks, so we can treat that. I knew that was the wrong decision. I'd operated on tumors like this with reasonable results. It's serious surgery. And it took me many years. You have to remove it en bloc. It's the only time in brain surgery you remove a tumor en bloc. And that's just down by the picos and the vertebrals and the brainstem, all sorts of stuff. But I should have stood up. I should have stuck to my guns, and I should have said, no, look, actually, I think he should have surgery and I can do it. But I didn't want to hurt my colleagues' feelings. And I still kept quiet. I also thought maybe I'm just getting old and my appetite for risk and doing very dangerous operations has diminished. So that's a sort of example of groupthink. I was putting the interests of my colleague and the group ahead of what I really thought was best for the patient. And he had radiotherapy, it was a disaster. I had to undergo selective later, and he was like, oh, that's persistent vegetative state. So that's an example of how easily things can go off the rails. So, and then, of course, the big problem with surgeons, with team working, is interpersonal conflict and jealousy, which comes back to the whole ambitious business of seeing surgery as a career for heroic individuals. And I like to illustrate that with Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs and the evil stepmother looking in the mirror. And all surgeons, and I include myself in this, it's mirror, mirror on the wall. Am I the best neurosurgeon of them all? Which, of course, is sort of cognitive dissonance denial. We all know that maybe actually, maybe somebody's a bit better than I am. And as consultants, as young consultants, particularly in the past, you go through this very difficult stage where if you don't take on the difficult cases, how will you ever get any better? And when I was a young consultant 35 years ago, there was no question of asking other people. I did actually. I used to go and ask Lindsay Simon at Queen Square. And I told a story in my first book. There was a terrible case of a spinal meningioma. And the family had gone to see Lindsay Simon, who was the most sort of famous neurosurgeon in England, and also considered himself a neurosurgeon in England, but he was a good surgeon. And he rang me up and said, oh, Henry, look, this is a young man's operation. But great, I've been licensed by Professor Simon, and I spent 18 hours on the operation, sort of about the artery perforator, and I saw her 10 years later in a persistent vegetative state. And I learned then that, never do an operation that a more senior consultant doesn't want to do. And it took me a long time to get back to operating on spinal meningiomas again. But it's changing now. I mean, in my department in London, we have several young consultants who really are extremely inexperienced because of the catastrophic changes in ours. But there's a good atmosphere where the senior consultants are mentors of them. They work together and getting away from the whole individual ethos in which I was trained. And I think that's a model that needs to be followed more and more, partly because the new generation of surgeons, both consultants and juniors, are much, much less experienced, even though they may be more specialized in what they do. And they really need to cultivate an atmosphere where you work together, you do difficult operations together, and you learn more together as a result because experience is now spread out and so diluted. But because of this insecurity and the fact we all know that sometimes the GMC says we must always put the patient first. Of course, we know we often don't. We put all patients first. I have a duty to my future patients. I have a duty to my trainees' future patients. So we know actually we have a rather equivocal relationship with patients. There's not one of straightforward, simple benevolence to the individual. And I think at the unconscious level, we all know that. And maybe that's the reason why it's said in England, you must never say, I want to help people when you apply to medical school. I don't know if that's still true. When I told my American colleagues that, they all burst out laughing. They said, no, we want them to say that because we know they're doing it for the money. So all these sort of problems I see my career, looking back in it, as being on a sort of tightrope, trying to find a balance between lots of competing things. And when you're on a tightrope, of course, you don't want to look down too much, or you might lose your balance. And there's a whole list of competing functions. I think most doctors face. First and the most obvious and one of the most profound ones is finding a balance between compassion and detachment. There's a lot of talk about doctors aren't sufficiently empathic. Well, the strict meaning of the word empathy is to actually feel what other people feel. Now, you couldn't do the work if that was literally the case. At the same time, it's very hard to understand and feel compassionate if you have got some personal experience of what your patients are going through. And of course, most medicine is handed out by young doctors and young nurses who don't have very much personal experience. I don't know what sort of doctor I would have been if my son hadn't been diagnosed with a brain tumor at the age of 3 months. He survived, fortunately, due to the surgery of Norman Grant, who then ended up training me at Great Ormond Street. But I'm sure it made some difference. And how we cross that gap, I don't know how much medical schools nowadays have patients coming to talk to students. I had one or two, and I found it terribly interesting, and I remember them very clearly. This was a long time ago. But at least when I give lectures to young doctors and medical students, I try to say, at least understand. You really don't understand what your patients are going through. We have to be this all-knowing, competent people. But actually, the world, and there's something again was reinforced when I became a patient with advanced prostate cancer myself. The world of the patient is so different from the world of us doctors until we become patients ourselves. And we have to find a balance. You have to be ambitious and individualistic, but you've got to be a good team worker as well. That again is a difficult balancing act we have to perform. And sometimes you have to find a balance between your conscience and what you think is best for the patient in front of you, and loyalty to the institution, or even obedience to the institution. Should you be a whistleblower? In my hospital in London, the cardiac surgeons all fell out. I think ultimately it was really personalities, but it was all argued about surgical results. It ended up to a stage where the professor of cardiac surgery, I know very well, was a woman. She opened her front door one day to find a dead animal and a decapitated doll on her front doorstep, sent to her by one of her colleagues. And it all got into the media. They lost all their trainees. The department has never really recovered. Their workload dropped. And that was an example where, you can do a lot of damage by upsetting the boat a bit too much. I had a colleague who really, I didn't think really cut the mustard surgically, but he wasn't so bad you could actually get rid of him anyway. All you could do was kind of divert some patients away. And all of us have to make compromises like this. Sometimes all of us will have colleagues who we think aren't really that good. We wouldn't really want them to treat my family, but we have to live with this and tolerate it. So it's another of his awkward balancing acts we have to do. Then there's one of vacation versus money. I work in all these impoverished countries, still do. I was just in Ukraine a few weeks ago, where healthcare is basically financially driven because the state sector is so impoverished that doctors can only make a living wage by you could call it corruption, you could call it informal co-payments. And I caused great offense, I'm told recently, and as I did a broadcast in Ukraine where I pointed out that Ukrainian neurosurgeons were making more money in the state system from informal co-payments for doing a brain tumor than an English neurosurgeon would be paid by Bupa in the private system. So, and obviously money can distort your decision making. It's not necessarily, would you say consciously, I'm going to rip off this patient. But the decision whether to operate or not, obviously it's about, you know, what are the risks of surgery and the benefits, what are the risks and benefits of no surgery. And the point is, these are probabilities. These are not simple mathematical additive sums. And we know from all the work by Kahneman and Tversky, the psychologists, that there are always unconscious cognitive biases that distort our estimation of probabilities. The weather forecast occasionally, unwisely, says there's 100% risk of something. And then they can be wrong. But the rest of the time, you can't be wrong. If you say, oh, it's a 99% chance. We say, well, it's a 1% chance. And of course, judging surgical results and probabilities and risks, and a very, very common problem, is underestimating the risks of surgery and overestimating the risks of not operating. And as the years go by and surgeons become less experienced, of my generation, who were very much more, let's say, neurosurgeons become more and more conservative for various reasons as they get older. But if you go to America, and you can see a completely different decision-making going on, much more aggressive. And obviously the commercial nature of so much of American healthcare is relevant to that. You have to have self-confidence. If you go into the operating theatre of a shaking wreck, you can't operate. And yet you must be endlessly self-critical as well. And that's another, it's difficult to feel ill of oneself. I had several cases of post-operative infections, two of which were disastrous, where I was slow to admit something had gone horribly wrong. These are very good operations, gone perfectly. And I delayed admitting the inevitable. Actually, my wonderful operation, I got pear-shaped. And that's an example. It's difficult to be self-critical. And that is my colleagues, if I'd shown these two post-operative problems to my colleagues, they'd have said to me, Henry, it's obviously an infection. It's an empyema. Do something about it. You know? So they don't have my optimism bias and my defensiveness. So that's an example of where good team working, if you feel able to talk to your colleagues about difficult problems, is so helpful. And you've got to find a balance between being honest with patients and pretense, and particularly perhaps in oncology, how much do you achieve with yet another round of chemotherapy? And yet, as my old surgical teacher, Adam Lewis, the general surgeon at the Royal Free, who was a lovely man, he said, you must never lie to patients, or you must never deprive them of hope. And again, trying to find that balance sometimes, particularly with cancer and malignant brain tumors, which I spent so much time working with, can be very difficult. And you have to find a balance between brave and being reckless. Tribal meningioma, I told you about, well, that was basically reckless, although to be kind of sanctified by a senior neurosurgeon. And then finally, very relevant nowadays, you have to find a balance between work and life. Now, my generation, there was no balance. It was all work. It was one reason my first marriage failed. My colleagues now at St. George's, they have working wives, they share the school run. It's a very, very different environment from the one I worked in. But it's still a struggle because our patients want us to be devoted to them and our family want us to be devoted to them. And there's no easy answer to that. On a slightly different note, and one of the really good developments in recent years in my career is an increasingly large number of women trainees. There are now 3 of the 12 consultants at St. George's are women, which is higher than the national average. And there is a rather nice paper published 3 weeks ago, I think, big study from Sweden and America, looking at follow-up 1 year after surgery, all sorts of operations. And the take-home message was that basically women surgeons had better long-term results than male surgeons. They didn't analyze this as to why, but obviously it's probably to do with risk and tolerance of risk and things like that. So, but that fits into my own personal experience. Like some of the safest of my trainees are the women. They may not go in for the big, heavy-hitting operations I did, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. And then operating room primatology, another nice paper from Frans de Waal, who is a Dutch primatologist who has been to the Nobel colony in San Diego, where the bonobos are allowed to, in a huge range, they can behave naturally as opposed to being, in a cage. And he put one of his postdocs in an operating theatre, I think in San Diego, and they used the same metrics for watching the surgeons operate, but they're used for looking at bonobos, and bonobos are interesting animals. I won't go into details. And they are our closest evolutionary ancestors, much less aggressive than chimpanzees. And they found the same metrics for looking for conflict and cooperation simply by observation, which they used on bonobos, seem to work quite well for human beings in the operating room. And there are three conclusions. The conflict was always directed downwards in the hierarchy. There was more conflict when there were more male members in the surgical team. And interestingly, there was less conflict when the team leader, the surgeon, was of a different gender from the majority of the team. So I'll leave you to make of that what you will, but I think it's quite interesting. Now, briefly on the NHS, you may have seen we're streeting, and the NHS will go bankrupt if it doesn't reform. But what I find so frustrating about all these people, and Jeremy Hunt as well, whom I know quite well, is they never actually say what reform. What are they going to do to reform? How are they going to make the NHS? What healthcare system elsewhere in the world is all doing better in terms of cost and outcomes? And the answer is deafening silence. But what is clear, and particularly if you look at the work from the Resolution Foundation and the King's Fund and the health, the other healthcare foundation, which used to be PPP, I think. This country, we spend less on healthcare than most European countries. Simple as that. And again, talking to my colleagues, they have these terrible clunky computers. It takes 20 minutes to get the computer working before they can do an outpatient clinic. They have a 14-character password. They have to change every 6 months. This is all because of lack of investment in good quality IT. So yes, the NHS is very inefficient, partly because of poor investment. What is to be done? Well, I must stop whinging. Here are a few suggestions. Firstly, more staff and more money, to state the obvious. In fact, the workforce plan, which was finally squeezed out of the government a couple of months ago, I mean, if it's borne out, about, I don't know, more than half of the workforce will be working in the NHS. I mean, it's pretty crazy reading. There's nothing about how to fund it. Abandon the European Working Time Directive. I wouldn't go back to the hours I worked, but depending on the specialty, it's clear to me my surgical trainees want to do more operating. They want to work longer hours. It needs to be funded, but I do think there's a big problem now with lack of surgical surgery, of lack of surgical expense. Surgery is a practical craft. You learn it by doing it, not by going on training courses or reading books. Yes, that's necessary, but practical experience is all important. Sort out community care. Government system been saying this for years, the bed blocking. Again, it's a financial question. They've got to bite the bullet and sort it out. It's ludicrous. There's so many NHS beds that basically used as older folks' care. And then restore doctors' autonomy. How do you do that? I don't know. But as I said earlier, the biggest change in my working life was a steady erosion of my feeling in charge of what I was doing. And if you don't feel in charge of what you're doing, you work less well. If you don't trust people, they're not going to work efficiently. And I think that a lot of that has been lost. The junior doctors' strike ostensibly is about money. I see it more really as about alienation and demoralization, which our generation would probably say is because of the loss of the firm, and the firm was destroyed by the European Working Time Directive. And no fault compensation, which is an interesting one. The lawyers wouldn't like that. It probably won't happen, but it's complicated. And the figures for litigation are amazing. It's going up and up and up. That's the legal cost of the claimant legal cost in 2000. That's the defense cost. But in fact, a large part of the money that goes to the patients and the families actually still goes to the lawyers for so-called success payments on the no-win. No fee business. And this, everybody says, is unsustainable, it's getting worse and worse. Go to Sweden. I was talking to my colleague there. I said, what do you do about consent forms? Consent forms? We don't have consent forms. We are a high trust society. I explained the operation to my patient, we shake hands. I said, what about litigate? Well, there isn't any litigation. They have a compensation scheme, as does New Zealand. It's difficult, it's not straightforward. In Sweden, they've got very generous social support anyway, and the compensation scheme for medical problems is on top of that. But the present system of adversarial law of tort, Anglo-Saxon lawyers jousting is hugely inefficient, hugely expensive. But obviously now there are an awful lot of vested interest involved in that. But if I ruled the world, I would try to come up with something like in New Zealand or the Scandinavian countries. This is interesting. This is just last week in The Economist. For whatever reason, there's so-called an iron law that because of the aging population and the increasing cost of medical technology, that healthcare costs as a proportion of GDP are going up and up and up. But recently that hasn't happened. It may only be a temporary change. The Economist doesn't really explain. It has various theoretical reasons, Baumol's cost disease and maybe greater productivity. But it's possible we'll not see this permanent increase in healthcare costs. What they don't discuss in that article is maybe outcomes are worse. But of course, outcomes are hard to measure. I went into medicine late. It was very much an affair of the heart. I spent 6 months. It wasn't my son's illness. It was working for 6 months as an operating theatre porter in a mining town north of Newcastle after I ran away from Oxford. And I thought, I want to be a surgeon. And then I discovered neurosurgery after my son's illness. And I totally sympathize with what Mark Twain had to say. If you love your work, it's not like work. That's a child I operated on just before the pandemic in Ukraine, in Lviv. There's a benign pilocytic cerebellar astrocytoma. She did wonderfully well. The next patient I operated on died terribly. Medullary-blastoma, postoperative hemorrhage, was left locked in, awful. But of course, the triumphs are only triumphant because of the disasters. You can't have one without the other. And I think for me, what defines medicine, looking back on it as a career, which is often very painful, is our frequent failure. It's not like running a business. It's quite different. And we have to cope with failure and learn from it and not be demoralized by it, but at the same time, not brutalized and made cold and indifferent. And of course, for many surgeons, one of the great joys of being a surgeon, it's a practical craft, is training the next generation. Those are my colleagues in the Children's Hospital in Lviv. Years ago, with the demise of the firm system, I introduced a morning meeting in my department, not a handover meeting, a meeting where all the juniors on call turned up, and usually most of the consultants, or some of them. And we talked about difficult cases, the work ahead, the admissions overnight, and as a meeting for making jokes and generally team building. It was very much my creation. I ran them. I did this sort of teaching on a sort of Socratic basis. It's always been very popular. Our department always comes out top of the national surveys for neurosurgical training, and because of that meeting. And I'm happy to say it's continued despite my absence. I still go in occasionally. So it has taken root, and it's really become a fundamental part of the culture of that department. And the consultants get together and talk about difficult cases. I hope that happens elsewhere, but as far as I know, it's unusual. And what about the old hospital? Well, it's now what you could call rich craft housing. And there's a sort of gesture to its past with Hounsfield House and Ambrose Lodge. Jamie Ambrose was the wonderful neuroradiologist who did all the early work on CT scanning with Hounsfield. That is the women's ward. That was Hawkins ward. And I remember seeing many, many patients there over the years. But there's a strange fact about hospitals, particularly in this country, that they're often so horrible that even the statues throw up their hands. I took that photograph when I was still working at St. George's, so I put it back upon Photoshop out the St. George's and make it more generic. And shortly after my lecture at a big meeting, that statue disappeared. But one of the few good things, although it was a mistake, about the new hospital building was it had this enormous balcony because they'd run out of money and had to chop bits of it off. So rather than being a block, they'd become a sort of ziggurat like that. And after 7 years of fundraising, campaigning, emails and argument, I was able to get it suicide-proofed at great expense. It's a PFI building and turned into a garden immediately outside the 2 neurosurgical wards. If neurosurgical patients, when the weather's good, can get outside, escape the prison-like atmosphere of the wards. I can't prove that actually leads to better outcomes, but it certainly is enormously popular with patients and their families. And during the pandemic, all the staff clad in their PPE kit could get out there as well. So looking back on my career, I learned many things from the old MBA, some bad, some good. But one was the importance of a green environment. The other was an importance of knowing everybody and proper team working. And the morning meeting and the roof garden are the things actually I'm proudest of, rather than all the other stuff. Thank you very much.
There are actually 62 people on Zoom. Whoops, I'm failing. There are actually 62 people on the Zoom who can hear you if you talk like this. So if anybody has a question, please could you repeat it and then talk into them? Thank you. So, questions?
Not provocative, you see, you all agree with everything I say. How do you take on and it has to come from the government, doesn't it? You know. Sorry, how the question was, how do you take on the lawyers if you're trying to get away from all this litigation? The answer is very difficult because so many people in the government are lawyers. It's a huge growth, is one part of the legal profession which is flourishing, medical litigation. It needs very firm leadership from above. And it's difficult, you know, really difficult, but I think it has to be faced up to. We have a very, very inefficient, and it's totally unfair in terms of natural justice. If I left somebody quadriplegic and it was my fault, they get millions of pounds. If it wasn't my fault, they get nothing. And yet the human suffering involved is the same. It's a completely crazy system. I think it works reasonably well in New Zealand, but it does cost money in the short term. I mean, it means you've got to put the income tax up, even though in the longer term it would save money. But it has to come from the government. I doubt if it will. It's £2.6 billion a year. It's about 2 to 3% of the entire NHS budget now goes on litigation. In the public inquiry following COVID, it was a portrait of one relative, very upset. She had lost her 98-year-old mother. The strong indication there that the job of the NHS is to make us all immortal, which of course would be utterly disastrous to the team. I wonder whether you'd like to comment on what the job of the NHS is, if it isn't to make us immortal. The question is that at the COVID inquiry, one relative was very upset that her 98-year-old mother had died from COVID. And the question is, should the NHS be keeping very old people alive, and how much money should go to that? I agree very much. I mean, first, I don't think assisted dying will solve the problem, but I'm a firm advocate and proponent in legalizing assisted dying, which is in many countries all over the world now. There's plenty of evidence. It does work reasonably well. It's not subject to lots of abuse. I think it's very difficult to know when to stop. And in neurosurgery, when I went into neurosurgery 40 years ago, literally anybody over the age of 65 who said, too old for neurosurgery, other than chronic subdurals. In my latter years, some of the most difficult decisions I faced was whether to operate on people in their 80s with big benign meningiomas causing slowly progressive disability. There's no easy answer to this. I do think a properly funded, set up primary healthcare system where GPs know their patients, have continuity of care, and we're discussing, and it should be sort of mandatory, but the GPs will discuss with older patients their directives, what sort of treatment they might or might not want, I think would help to some extent. I mean, I found on the whole, most of my older patients are pretty matter of fact about dying, you know. They could face up to it better than the medical staff. But if you're a GP going to some old folks' home, you have an old lady with pneumonia, if you're not going to prescribe antibiotics, presumably you have to find out if their relatives, ring the relatives up, discuss it with them. Much quicker, just to prescribe the antibiotics and bugger off, you know. So I think part of the solution to your question is going back to having a proper primary healthcare system, as they have in Norway. I'm sure you all read that paper last year in the British Journal of General Practice, my bedside reading, a population-wide study of patients in Norway, where they have a very strong primary healthcare system, showing that patients who had the same doctor for several years had a 25% lower mortality rate, much lower rate of hospital admission, much fewer investigations done compared to patients who only have the same doctor for 1 year. I mean, it's common sense, really. But that we really have to work back to that. I think that the great strength of the historical NHS was the GP system, the primary care system.
Very good question.
Yeah. Yeah.
Andrew Mitchell saying, what qualities should we look for in potential surgical trainees?
Well, it depends. It depends to some extent on the specialty, I suppose. I don't think it's a manual thing. If you want to be a surgeon, you can operate. Operating isn't very difficult. I mean, it's in terms of what you do with your hands. That may sound a bit of a throwaway comment, but it's true. The problem is the decision making. So I'm not very interested in having special tests of manual dexterity. I think being capacity for hard work, clearly, I mean, it is hard work, long hours, and the capacity for self-criticism, things like that, and seeing surgery as much a team activity as one as self-aggrandizement. But how you assess those things in wannabe trainees, I don't know, and I think there's very little data on what makes a good doctor. But I certainly would want to get away from the heroic individual. And quite often, when I still had a role in selecting trainees, which then was taken away, it all got centralized in Sheffield, I think, I was deeply distrustful of the people who said, I always wanted to be a brain surgeon. I want to be a brain surgeon. And I would ask them, well, what if they've already done some general surgery, which of course isn't the case now. I'd ask them, what's different about neurosurgery? And they say, oh, exquisite precision. Actually, what I wanted to hear was, you spend much more time talking to the relatives than in other branches of surgery, because so many of your patients are ill and disabled. And some of them got that. And then that was, I thought, was a big mark in their favor. No, because it's tax funded. Sorry, can we take the NHS out of party politics? To which I think the answer is no, because it's tax funded. And the Treasury has always been totally opposed to a hypothecated tax, health tax, where everybody pays money just. Now, the argument then, which is beyond me, because I don't know the details, is whether you had some kind of insurance-based system as you have in Holland, which had a tax-funded system. Now it's indirectly, but I don't quite know how it works out. But the fact remains, countries like Holland spend more on healthcare than we do. And I don't think you really can judge what to do with the NHS until it has been properly funded. And that's a huge problem. No, I think as long as it's tax funded, it's always going to be subject to politics. Maybe we have to accept that. That's why the NHS is chronically underfunded. Although having said that, the Scandinavian healthcare systems are tax funded. But if we could all be like Scandinavia, the world would be a better place.
I said I was going to really enjoy your talk because of the title, and we are,
Yeah.
And you did say self-secular surgery for your friends, and yes, right. I don't know how many surgeons there are here, but is it actually self-secular doctors you want to say? Physicians and general practitioners?
I think it applies to all of us. We have to boost up our ego. We have tremendous responsibility. But I think with surgeons, because you actually operate and stick knives into people, you need more of it. And I think it applies to all of us to a certain extent. And the problem is, yes, we often fail in all branches where, even pathologists, again, have misreporting. All general practitioners will have one or two patients where they missed a cancer diagnosis. We all have this problem to live with. And it's difficult to think ill of oneself. You couldn't do the work. That's why I think good colleagues is such a good solution in theory, and also they understand, and you spread the burden a bit. Does that answer the question? A bit waffly, but no. Well, we're all bad. It depends on the responsibility and how acute what you do is. But yes, it applies. But it applies to all human beings. We all have a high opinion of ourselves.
From Amy Knight. When I worked in the NHS, junior doctors used to work in pairs on the wards. But when they reduced junior doctors' working hours, most junior doctors were made to work on their own on ward.
Yep.
And this has been detrimental because doctors cannot discuss cases together in an ongoing way, face to face, and therefore don't benefit from frequent case discussion and principle, which is exactly
agree. Yeah. No, when I was on call as a junior, I was always on either as a registrar, the senior registrar, or senior registrar with a registrar and a houseman. So in fact, there were 3 people. No, I agree. It's a big loss.
I was going to make a point about the empathy.
Yeah.
Here. There was a study in the BMJ some while ago, and it showed that if you were very, very empathic, you faced the risk of burnout.
Exactly.
You expressed so much.
Exactly.
And actually, the people who did best were the people who learned empathy, but actually weren't empathic.
No, I think that figures. I mean, there's a lot of acting involved in being a doctor. When we're junior doctors, we have to pretend to a competence and confidence, which our patients have no choice other than to place in us, when we know it's not true. I mean, I illustrate this with my wife, Kate, who often comes up to the JR, or not as often as she should, really, for her Crohn's and has blood taken. And she tells a story, and she's an anthropologist, so she's a good observer of human beings. And she was having a blood taken once by my junior doctor, and he left a long line of bruises and pricks up her arms. We've all been, maybe not the younger doctors now because they're phlebotomists. And what does he say to her after jabbing her many times? Oh, I'm terribly sorry. I haven't really done this very much before. And of course, Kate was very upset, felt she was in the hands of a bloody maniac. What should he have said? Well, he should have said, "You have got terrible veins." And then she'd have been happy. So there is this need sometimes to lie. And the other thing, which I didn't really understand consciously at the early stages of my career, with that struggle, you face an ethical problem right from the start. At what point do you say to the patient, "I'm sorry, I can't do it.
Yes.
I shall go and ask for somebody more experienced"? That's difficult, And we faced that problem for many years, which is why, again, if you have a good team, it does help a bit. But self-deception is necessary to some extent. The problem is controlling it.
John Stein?
I haven't said much about management.
Yeah. Again, this is a few years ago here at the JR, coming back to my wife, who was admitted with an acute fistula and abscess, and had for about 6-7 weeks of IV feeding. She had an emergency operation, and then was an inpatient, which she hated, having parenteral feeding. She was now fit to have formal resection of the ileocecal junction, and she was prepared for major surgery, which might have ended up with an ileostomy, which she would have almost been suicidal about. She was prepared for surgery 5 mornings in a row. And each day, by the middle of the day, she was told, "Terribly sorry, we haven't got time to do it today." Eventually, I rang up the surgeon, or rather the surgeon's secretary, and said, "Look, I was working full time myself. When will she have the operation?" And she said, "Well, it's not really up to Prof. It's up to the list broker." And this was the days when the trust was fined for cancelling elective operations. Kate was no longer an emergency, and she was now competing as an inpatient elective patient with all these routine elective cases. And eventually she was sent home with a family-sized bottle of morphine, made into a proper elective case and then readmitted. Now that's an example of, and that was a few years ago. I'm told that JR doesn't have that list broker system now, but it's perilously close to that at St. George's, where the management essentially dictate and decide who's going to get operated on. And this ultimately is a problem of lack of resources. You know, there aren't enough nurses and beds. And management has been put in to sort of squeeze blood out of a stone. And although when I had the Christmas lunch of a department last Friday, I met the transformation manager, who struck me as a bit of a twit. But essentially, the management has been put there to save money. You know, it's not about improving patient care. And they are on a totally different planet from the clinicians. They just don't have that overwhelming sense of personal responsibility. What happens to patients? Yeah, we need management. I'm not going to knock management as a whole. But on the whole, I'm afraid my experience of it in the NHS is abysmal. You know, they're not very good. They come and go. They talk a lot of jargon. And the reality of lack of resources, they can't do anything about it. And their masters are the hierarchy of ending up in the government. So it's, I do think it's managed, but on the other hand, other healthcare systems are all getting overmanaged as well. The American system, which obviously isn't a model nobody in their right mind would follow. There's a vast number of people in the insurance companies handling all the claims. And if you had American friends who tried to get treatment and then sort out all the paperwork afterwards, it's a complete nightmare. So it's not totally unique to